It is no secret that I am a fan of magical girls. Despite my protests as a child, I am very much a girly girl, and that is something that I embrace nowadays. My enthusiasm for magical girl media knows no bounds. However, actually talking about magical girl shows, especially online, can be difficult. This is for a variety of reasons. I'm currently working on two large magical girl related videos. One going over Smile Pretty Cure and its dub, Glitter Force, and the more relevant one, Magical Girl's Sight. And I feel like a lot of the public perception of specifically Magical Girl Sight comes from the perception of the Magical Girl genre as a whole. Now, considering Sight is like that, I foresee it very much not being monetized. So, if you would like to help support me in this arduous endeavor, you can do so on my Patreon. If you mention magical girls in the modern anime community, it's likely someone will bring up Madoka Magica, which is a well-respected entry in the genre and one that I really like. However, the way people often talk about it feels off, for lack of a better term. People cite it as the herald of the end for the magical girl genre, as following it, several more shows that would be dubbed Dark Magical Girls would be released. This is something that I felt for a couple of years now, and what I'm feeling is the idea that people, mainly in the English-speaking anime community, don't actually care about magical girl shows and don't really respect them as an art. Now, before we can discuss the modern state of magical girls, we have to know a bit of history. Most people agree that the magical girl genre began in 1962, when Himitsu no Ako-chan began publishing chapters in Shueisha's magazine Ribbon, which I love that for the title of a girl's magazine. The story follows Ako, who is gifted a magic mirror that allows her to transform into anything she wants. This series, as well as Sally the Witch, are considered to be the starting point of the magical girl subgenre. This is interesting, seeing as Sally the Witch actually has its roots in American media, being inspired by the 1964 American series Bewitched. In general, the beginnings of the Maho Shoujo genre had more of a witchy vibe. Other such examples include 1972's Maho Tsukai Chappi, 1973's Miracle Girl Limit-chan, and 1974's Majoko Megu-chan. Then, during the 80s, the genre would continue to evolve. This is the era where we see a lot of stories that follow the little girl uses magic to turn into a teenager sort of thing. Of course, there's the famous magical princess Minky Momo from 1982, Creamy Mami, the Magic Angel in 1983, and Magical Emmy, the Magic Star in 1985. All of these shows shared the concept of a young girl who uses magic to grow up and uses that ability to help solve problems. And then, Sailor Moon burst onto the scene in 1991 in Kodansha's magazine Nakayoshi. Written by Naoko Takeuchi, it was an instant hit, and only a year later, in 1992, the Sailor Moon anime would begin airing, and to say it was a cultural sensation is an understatement. Fun fact, the reason the Sailor Scouts' nails get painted, so to speak, at the beginning of the transformation, even though they all wear gloves, is because of merchandising. Sailor Moon was a hit for various reasons, from Naoko's striking art style, to the soon-to-be iconic uniforms of the Sailor Scouts, to the epic battle between good versus evil that played out on a planetary scale. Now, that isn't to say that there weren't magical girls kicking ass before Sailor Moon put her makeup on. Cutie Honey was fighting straight-up gangsters since 1973, and also being the first female protagonist in a shonen manga series, not to mention other battle heroine series pre-1991. But there would be an uptick in more action-oriented magical girl stories. Magic Knight Rayearth, Wedding Peach, Cardcaptor Sakura, Nurse Angel Ririka SOS, Corrector Yui, and Phantom Thief Jean all followed the more plot-driven, battle-heavy style of magical girls. Not to say that they followed this structure because of Sailor Moon, but there was certainly a trend. And that isn't to say all magical girls in this time were strictly battle-driven. Ojamajo Doremi came out in 1999, harkening back to the Majoko days of the magical girl genre, as well as Yume no Crayon Okoku. The 2000s would bring us yet another new era of magical girls. Tokyo Mew Mew, Princess Tutu, Powerpuff Girls Z, Pre-Tier, Full Moon O Sagashite, Mermaid Melody, and of course, the eventual powerhouse that would become Pretty Cure. Fans of magical girls were living large in these days, especially with several of these shows getting an English dub, which allowed for them to reach a wider audience. Now, the quality of those dubs varies, but what was important is that people outside of Japan were seeing these shows. Defining a genre can be both simple yet difficult. Obviously, if a story has magic of some kind, it's fantasy. If it focuses on the development of a romantic relationship, it's a romance. If it has hyper-advanced technology, sci-fi. But even there, it's not always so cut and dry. Science fiction stories can have romance in them. Romance stories can take place in fantastical worlds, and fantasy stories can have elements of advanced technology. So when we get into more specific genres, that becomes a bit harder to define. So, what is a magical girl story? The most basic definition of a magical girl show is a show with a girl who is magical. It's a pretty self-explanatory genre, what else do you want? Jokes aside, a better basic definition would be a young girl with magical powers who often, but not always, uses those powers in an alter ego. There's also a deeper and interesting history involving demographics and marketing in Japanese media. Despite popular belief, shoujo and shonen are not genres, they are demographics. In anime and manga, there are a couple of different demographics: shonen, shoujo, seinen, josei, and kodomo-muke. These demographics are quite literal, but because I'm currently speaking in English, I need to translate them. Shonen is young boy, and shoujo is young girl. Seinen is young man, josei is young woman, and kodomo-muke is children. These categories are not concrete. They are entirely dependent on the magazine that the manga is published in weekly. So, what manga magazine a story is published determines which of these categories it falls into. For instance, the case study of Vanitas has a large female audience, and people make jokes about it having a lot of fujoshi female appeal, but it's not a shoujo series. Rather, it's a shonen series, because it is published in a shonen magazine. Going back to magical girls, there are loads of different kinds. Some get their powers from supernatural beings, some get them through the power of science. Some are fighting for the fate of the world, and others are just using magic to solve everyday problems. There isn't a one-size-fits-all formula for a magical girl, and that's part of why the genre is so fun.
The interesting thing is that, despite shonen and shoujo starting out as demographic markers, they've sort of evolved into colloquial genre terms. In general, when people refer to something as a shonen, that typically means it's got a lot of cool fight scenes, monsters to beat, some kind of cool power system, and follows more of an action-adventure storyline. When people refer to shoujo, however, they typically mean a series that has a lot of in-depth characterization and a well-developed romance. So despite the fact that shonen and shoujo started out as purely demographic categories, they actually did become genres in a way. That's just the natural evolution of language, which is really cool. But at the same time, it reveals an inherent bias, and that bias says that media for girls is more geared towards slice of life or romance stories, while media for boys can be this big action adventure. And then when it comes to magical girls, that preconceived notion is a major part of the problem.
With all that history established, what do I mean when I say that magical girl shows are disrespected? Well, a few things. Part of the problem is so much of the Western and more specifically American conceptualization of magical girls is just Sailor Moon. Now, Sailor Moon is undoubtedly an important part of Mahou shoujo history, but it is far, far from the only one. If we're being completely honest, there have been a bunch of American cartoons from before Sailor Moon's time that also count as magical girl, such as Gem and the Holograms, Princess Guinevere and the Jewel Riders, and the original She-Ra. But, whatever. Yet most magical girl references you see in American media are just Sailor Moon. And whenever another magical girl show does actually get recognition in English-speaking fandom, it gets compared to Sailor Moon. When Magie Lumiere came out, both the manga in 2021 and the anime in 2024, several articles and sites described it as a satire/parody of Sailor Moon, and I struggle to understand what that means because these two properties are nothing alike. I genuinely would like for one of the writers of these articles to explain to me their definition of satire because it is not the same as everyone else's. And of course, I know that these articles are clickbaity fluff pieces, but it still does have an impact on the perception of magical girls. But then it comes to the question of why. Why is it that Sailor Moon and occasionally Cardcaptor Sakura are the only shows people actually bring up when talking about magical girls, unless you're in a specific magical girl community? That's probably because not a lot of magical girl shows get dubbed anymore, which limits the audience they're able to reach. Of course, in the 90s and early 2000s, a lot of magical girl shows were brought to the US. Sailor Moon, dubbed by DIC Entertainment, Cardcaptor Sakura by Nekvana. Then there's the Canadian dub of Futari wa Pretty Cure, done by Ocean Productions. And of course, the 4Kids dubbing of Tokyo Mew Mew and Ojamajo Doremi, renamed Mew Mew Power and Magical Doremi. But once we move past the 2000s, we don't really see any more dubs of anime for little girls. And that isn't for lack of material. In that time, there were loads of magical girl shows being released. Jewel Pet, still Pretty Cure, Mermaid Melody, Shugo Kara, and more. Now, of course, there's a lot that goes into dubbing a show from one language to another. American entertainment companies have to see a show, decide that they want to dub it, get the license and rights to do so, and then, do all the normal things you would do with a new show. Production, advertisement, merchandise, all that stuff. But there lies a major problem. Companies have to decide they want to dub a show targeted at a young female audience. At the same time as things like Jewel Pet and Sugar Sugar Rune were airing in Japan, America got the dub for things like Bakugan and Beyblade. Of course, those properties have a heavy toy influence, which is the primary element to their success. However, the same could very, very easily be said about many magical girl shows of the time. Jewel Pet has a load of toys that I could very easily see little girls in America collecting. Fushigi no Boshi Futeko Hime, which would obviously need a name translation, has loads of cute toy potential, and Pretty Cure has a huge merchandising aspect that we'll talk more about later. So how come only the shows that traditionally appealed to young boys got brought over to America? Unfortunately, a lot of this is just straight up misogyny. Companies, especially at that time, didn't feel like there was a viable market for a young female audience, and historically, women and girls have been a demographic often neglected. Then there's the general modern discussion of magical girls. You see people saying things about how magical girls are all super dark and tragic these days. Magical girl shows are all depression and sadness and edge, and that is a take that speaks to an understandable ignorance about magical girls. So, I would like to put forth a hypothesis that has very little concrete evidence behind it, but it's something that I've picked up on over the years from seeing AniTubers and other people online talking about magical girls, and that is this. See, in the 90s, if you wanted to watch a show, you had to be on a certain TV channel at a certain time. But of course, you'd probably want to get ready a little early so you don't miss it. So you end up watching a little bit of the show that comes on before yours. Or maybe you're watching cartoons with your little sister or something and end up watching one of her shows and you start really liking it. That, I believe, is what happened to a lot of young boys in the 90s. They wanted to watch Gundam or Zatch Bell or Dragon Ball, but before they could, they had to sit through an episode of Sailor Moon or Cardcaptor Sakura. They were kind of forced to watch the more girly cartoon, but ended up really liking them, and that's all fine and good. Great, actually. But then the internet becomes more of a mainstream thing, and with that comes streaming, as well as, let's be real, sites that hosted pirated anime. So generally, it was easier to find and access new shows. Those people who liked Sailor Moon or Cardcaptor out of circumstance, do you think they went out of their way to find more of that type of show? Because the answer is honestly no. Why would they? Their friends were probably talking about Full Metal Alchemist, Bleach, Naruto, Death Note, and so on. So why would they go out of their way to watch Jewel Pet Tinkle? Here's an anecdote. I had just explained this theory to my roommate, and they were like, yeah, that makes sense. And while they were in the kitchen, I started watching a video about magical girls that I vehemently disagree with. And they were talking about how they liked magical girl shows. But I couldn't help but notice that they were only showing clips from 2. And those 2 shows were Sailor Moon and Cardcaptor Sakura. And from the kitchen, my roommate shouted,
"This is literally proving your point!"
So, I'm right. And then, of course, Madoka Magica released in 2011, and partly because the show calls its characters straight up magical girls, the genre was pushed into the forefront of the anime community. And for a lot of people, this was their first exposure to the concept of Mahou shoujos since Sailor Moon, and that was kind of all they had to compare it to. And now that the magical girl genre is back in the spotlight for the English-speaking world, people start to notice other dark fantasy magical girl shows. Daybreak Illusion, Yuki Yuna is a Hero, Magical Girl Raising Project, and what felt like the nail in the coffin, Magical Girl Sight. What was the reason for this trend, if not for the death of the traditional magical girl? I have 2 counterpoints. The first being dark magical girl shows have always been a thing. It isn't new. Everyone knows Revolutionary Girl Utena is a darker magical girl show. Directed by Kunihiko Iruhara, the same person who directed the Sailor Moon anime, Revolutionary Girl Utena came out in 1997 and it is very good. I watched it for the first time just last year and enjoyed it immensely. And once the show hits around the halfway point, it ramps up in the themes of abuse, incest, manipulation, and sexual violence. Pre-Tier from 2000 is another noticeably darker Mahou story. Death is a constant threat looming over the characters. Grief and depression are core themes, and there's subtle discussion and reference to suicidal ideation. Princess Tutu from 2002 is another good example. While it's not as explicitly dark, it goes down a very existential path with themes of free will and destiny, and what that truly means. Not to mention, the trend of magical girls but for adults is nothing new. Panty and Stocking is an obvious example, coming out in 2011, but it goes much older. Papillon Rose started out as an internet joke and a parody of Sailor Moon and Cutie Honey before, I think, becoming an actual OVA series. That's a little fuzzy. And also there's something called Butt Attack Punisher Girl. So like magical girl parodies with sexual overtones is super not new and super not unique. Not to mention, what people consider traditional magical girls never actually went away. Franchises like Precure and Jewel Pet were still trucking along just fine. Little Witch Academia started out as a short film in 2013, which got a second short film in 2015, and then a full series in 2017. Then there's also Flip Flappers, and while that one is a bit more esoteric and mature, I wouldn't put it in the dark magical girl category. And then there's non-Japanese magical girl shows, which very much exist and should be included in discussions of the genre. Lolly Rock is a French magical girl idol series that began airing in 2014, and it even has an English dub. Flowering Heart is a co-production between South Korean and Japanese animation studios, which plays into the young girl transforms into an adult to solve problems type of thing. All of these shows came out between Madoka Magica and Magical Girl Sight. These shows are clear evidence that the magical girl genre was not in any way negatively impacted by Madoka Magica. And part of this debate is saying that, oh, sequel series and reboots don't count, so the yearly seasons of Pretty Cure didn't count. Little Witch Academia didn't count either for some reason. Sailor Moon Crystal doesn't count, which I find the exclusion of those shows for the sake of saying the magical girl genre is dead is rather silly and stupid. But if we're playing with this type of logic, there is another, more reasonable explanation behind the lack of new magical girl IPs at this time that isn't Madoka Magica, and that is Pretty Cure. See, since the 80s, a lot of children's cartoons have been made to sell toys, and that is a trend that continues to this day. This can be seen all the way back in the days of Minky Momo, where the toy company pulling their sponsorship caused the creator to retaliate by killing the main character. She got better though, don't worry. And a lot of magical girl shows mentioned previously had and have a huge merchandise aspect. Wands, compacts, dolls, and anything else that can be bought and sold. But eventually, one franchise rose above them all. Pretty Cure essentially has a monopoly on magical girls fighting monsters of the week, each season being carefully designed to market to the widest possible audience and to show off all the cool new toys that your parents can buy for you now. The reason new magical girl shows weren't being produced in the time period after Madoka Magica, so the 2010s, isn't because Madoka Magica destroyed the genre. It was because toy companies and execs didn't feel like competing with one of the largest franchises in the country. I do want to add a side note that just because a show is made to sell toys, that doesn't mean there can't be an actual heart to the story that gets told. Animators and artists work to create touching stories within the commercial constraints they've been given, and I think that's an important thing to just remember in general. So, to recap, Madoka Magica did not kill the magical girl genre. In my personal opinion, that idea came about because people watched Sailor Moon and Cardcaptor Sakura's English dub when they aired in the 90s. But then as they grew up and found other sources to watch anime other than cable TV, they were no longer sort of forced to watch those more girly shows. So they just didn't. And that's fine, it's totally okay. And then, renowned studio Shaft releases Madoka Magica, and everyone goes like, whoa! Meanwhile, Pretty Cure and other typical magical girl shows continue onward, but get ignored because, bluntly put, they're for little girls, and most people who aren't little girls don't care about that stuff. So all the attention goes to the dark fantasy shows made for an older audience, and because people don't care about shows made for little girls and don't pay them any mind, these dark fantasy shows are all that exists in their mind. As I was editing this, Doraemon released a video about Princess Tutu, and that honestly helped me put into words this weird phenomenon that I see. People call Madoka Magica a deconstruction, or say Princess Tutu isn't like other magical girl shows to create a degree of separation from the rest of the genre, because people like those shows. And there's this cultural idea that feminine things or media made for girls is just bad. Things that are cutesy and pink and frilly and most importantly, feminine are so weirdly not allowed to be good art. Also, if you have to caveat your Princess Tutu recommendation with, oh, I know the name is silly, then you are literally the problem I'm talking about. Honestly, everything I've just said for the last couple of minutes just boils down to misogyny, and that really sucks, and I'm sad now. I don't want to be an elitist here. I have not seen every Magical Girl show, and I am nowhere near the arbiter of knowledge for the genre, try as I might. If someone watched Sailor Moon as a kid before Dragon Ball came on and really liked it, that's okay. If they liked Madoka Magica when it came out, that's okay too. If those are the only two Magical Girl shows someone ever watches, that's literally okay. You don't have to force yourself to consume Magical Girl media. But it's when those people make these grand sweeping statements about the genre from that very narrow assumption and perspective that rubs me the wrong way. I've seen Evangelion, but do I go around saying how it changed the mecha anime genre forever? No, because I don't typically watch mecha anime, and I don't know enough about the genre to make that statement. Something that never seems to get talked about outside of specific Magical Girl communities are all the wonderful girly pop pieces of media that are always being made. The last couple of years has brought us a lot of great Magical Girl related things. Tokyo Mew Mew New was a wonderful retelling of a classic story. Magie Lumiere's anime adaptation brought an already amazing story to new audiences. Acro Trip is a hilarious buddy comedy between a Magical Girl loving nerd and the pathetic villain said Magical Girl battles against. Princessin Orchestra is a promising new TV anime from the creator of Symphogear meant for all ages, and Magical Girl Dandelion is already such a wonderful and fun manga. And of course, that's just looking at Japanese Magical Girls. Over in South Korea, Catch Teeny Ping has been making waves and has even been brought over to the States through Netflix. Sleepless Domain is an amazing Magical Girl webcomic with fun characters and a fascinating story. Magical Warrior Diamond Heart is a visual novel about a magical team known as the Crystal Warriors with a playable demo out right now. There's I Don't Want to Be a Magical Girl, an in-development indie animation, Magical Boy, a story about a trans boy who comes from a long line of magical girls. Bee and Puppy Cat, She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, Steven Universe, all the classic Barbie movies, and even the new ones. I haven't seen the new ones, but like hell, let's have fun. I've been playing Infinity Nikki a lot lately, and honestly, huge Magical Girl vibes. And then there are Magical Girl characters from non-Magical Girl media. Sparkle Cadet from Craig of the Creek, Minerva from ReZero, Mamika from Recreators, and just... The Magical Girl genre isn't dead. It's never been dead. It just isn't given attention by a community that values male protags always getting the girl and the story always justifying their worldview. There's a lot of Magical Girl stories to be experienced if you just look for them. Basically, watch other Magical Girl shows or, like, shut up.